In the middle of an emergency meeting at Sterling Dynamics, Callista Sterling froze as her 8-year-old daughter, Audrey, filled the whiteboard with a system of equations that left the lead engineer speechless. "Who taught you this?" she demanded. Audrey whispered. "Mr. Leo, from the basement." The entire room went rigid. Leo? Who? Callista had never hired a tutor. At the back of the room, a man in a faded gray janitor uniform, still holding a wet mop, lifted his head and looked straight at her. Who was Leo? Why did Audrey trust only him? And why did a janitor understand the core algorithm that Callista's million-dollar engineering team had been struggling with for weeks? Callista Sterling had built her reputation on precision. Every morning began the same way. A review of key performance indicators, a conference call with investors before the markets opened, and a mental checklist of tasks that left no room for imperfection. Sterling Dynamics had become a leader in predictive analytics, and the pressure to maintain that position never eased. The company occupied 3 floors of a steel and glass tower in the financial district, where everyone moved with purpose and spoke in abbreviations that outsiders could not decode. That Monday, Audrey had arrived at the office because her nanny had called in sick. Callista had no backup plan. She settled her daughter in a small meeting room with coloring books and a tablet, hoping the day would pass without incident. But Audrey, restless and curious, had wandered into the employee pantry during the mid-morning lull. That was where she first encountered Leo Carter. He was 36, though the lines around his eyes suggested someone who had lived through more than his years implied. He wore the same gray uniform every day, moving through the building like a shadow, emptying trash bins and mopping floors. Most employees did not notice him. Those who did offered polite nods before returning to their screens. Audrey had been watching him carefully sweep up shattered glass from a dropped coffee pot when a shard rolled toward her shoe. Without thinking, she bent down to help. Leo glanced at her, surprised, then smiled faintly. He pulled a napkin from his pocket and sketched a simple logic puzzle with a marker he kept clipped to his belt. It was a pattern game, counting steps to reach a solution. Audrey's eyes lit up. She solved it in seconds, then looked at him expectantly, waiting for another. For the first time that day, she laughed. The moment passed quickly. Leo returned to his work, and Audrey went back to the meeting room, but she folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into her backpack. A small treasure she would revisit later. Neither of them realized that this brief exchange had planted a seed, one that would soon grow into something far larger than either of them anticipated. The weekly demo meeting was supposed to be routine. William Harding, the chief technology officer, had scheduled it to showcase the latest iteration of their forecasting algorithm to a group of potential government partners. The platform was designed to predict risk patterns in financial markets, offering early warnings that could save institutions billions. But during the live demonstration, the numbers began to drift. Small errors compounded into glaring inconsistencies. William's face tightened as he adjusted parameters, but the system refused to stabilize. Audrey had been sitting quietly in the corner, her tablet forgotten in her lap. She watched the screens with a focus that surprised the adults in the room. When the projections flickered again, she stood and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. Before anyone could stop her, she began writing. Her handwriting was clumsy, the letters uneven, but the mathematics were unmistakable. She outlined a method to isolate extreme noise in the data, a transformation that would reduce the error margin by recalibrating the baseline assumptions. The room went silent. William stared at the board, then at the child who had just solved a problem his team had been wrestling with for weeks. Callista felt a strange mix of pride and unease. She had known her daughter was bright, but this was different. This was knowledge that came from somewhere, from someone. "Audrey," Callista said carefully, kneeling beside her. "Where did you learn this?" "Mr. Leo showed me," Audrey said simply. "He explains things with napkins. It makes sense when he does it." Henry Marks, the facilities manager, stepped forward, his face flushed. "Ma'am, janitorial staff are not authorized to interact with clients or family members. This is a serious breach of protocol." Callista felt the eyes of the investors on her. She forced herself to remain calm, to project control, even as her mind raced. She nodded curtly. "We'll address this internally." "Thank you, Henry." But inside, she felt something she had not experienced in years. Uncertainty. Callista found Leo in the basement supply room an hour later. He was restocking cleaning chemicals, his movements methodical and unhurried. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, trying to summon the authority she wielded so easily upstairs. But something about his stillness made her feel off balance. "Did you teach my daughter mathematics?" she asked. Leo turned, meeting her gaze. "I answered her questions. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" He set down the bottle he was holding. She asked why numbers behave the way they do. "I showed her patterns. She figured out the rest." William appeared behind Callista, his expression tight. "Mr. Carter, company policy is clear. Unauthorized contact with executive family members is grounds for immediate termination." Leo said nothing. He simply looked at William, then back at Callista, as if waiting for her to make the decision. Henry arrived moments later, already drafting an incident report on his tablet. The situation was escalating, and Callista knew she had to act quickly to contain it. But then Audrey appeared at the top of the stairs, her face streaked with tears. She clutched the napkin from that first morning, now wrinkled and stained. "Please don't fire him, Mom. He's the only one who listens." Callista's chest tightened. She looked at her daughter, then at Leo, and felt the ground shift beneath her. Something was wrong here. Something deeper than protocol violations. She had built her career on reading patterns, on finding the signals hidden in noise. And every instinct told her that this man was not what he appeared to be. As Leo turned back to his work, Callista caught a glimpse of his handwriting on a maintenance log. The symbols were precise, almost elegant, and they reminded her of something she had seen before. Years ago, in the earliest drafts of Sterling Dynamics' first artificial intelligence project, someone had annotated the code with notes in that same distinct style. She had always assumed it was one of the original engineers, someone long since promoted or transferred. Now she wondered if she had been wrong. Serena Mitchell, Callista's head of public relations, was the one who found the file. She had been tasked with conducting a routine background check on all personnel who had come into contact with Audrey, a precaution to protect the company from liability. What she discovered was buried deep in the archived records, flagged as confidential and restricted to senior management. Leo Carter had not always been a janitor. 5 years ago, he had been the lead engineer on Sterling Dynamics' safety protocols team. He had been responsible for designing the fail-safes that protected the company's data centers from catastrophic overloads. But then, something had gone wrong. A critical system shutdown had occurred during a high-stakes product launch. The incident had caused a brief but damaging outage, and the resulting investigation had placed the blame squarely on Leo. The report accused him of triggering an unnecessary emergency shutdown, costing the company millions in lost revenue and reputation. He had been quietly let go, his departure framed as a resignation. No lawsuits, no public statements. Just a signature on a severance agreement and a non-disclosure clause that kept him silent. Serena forwarded the file to Callista with a single line of commentary. The report was signed by the previous executive board. William Harding was one of the approving managers. Callista read the document 3 times, searching for details that did not add up. The technical language was dense, but one phrase stood out. Unauthorized emergency shutdown, initiated against direct orders. She thought about Leo's calm demeanor, the precision of his explanations to Audrey. This was not the profile of someone reckless. This was someone who had been careful, deliberate, and methodical. That evening, she found Audrey sitting on her bedroom floor, surrounded by notebooks filled with sketches and equations. Callista sat beside her, feeling the weight of decisions she had not yet made. "Mr. Leo taught me something else," Audrey said quietly. "He taught me to count my breaths when I'm scared. He said it's like fixing errors in a program. You just have to slow down and find the right rhythm." Callista closed her eyes. She had spent years teaching herself not to second-guess, not to doubt. But now, sitting with her daughter, she realized that certainty could be its own kind of blindness. The pressure from the board was immediate. By Tuesday morning, Callista had received 3 calls from investors expressing concern about the optics of the situation. A janitor with access to proprietary demonstrations. A child wandering unsupervised. The potential liability was staggering, they said, and the solution was simple. Reinforce the protocols, ensure it never happened again, and move on. Callista drafted the internal memo herself. It was short, clinical, and unambiguous. All non-essential personnel are prohibited from interacting with clients, partners, or executive family members outside their designated duties. Violations will result in immediate disciplinary action. She sent it to Henry, who wasted no time implementing the new rules. He posted printed copies on every floor, sent a company-wide email, and made a point of confronting Leo in front of the break room where several employees could witness. Callista did not see the confrontation, but she heard about it later from Serena, who described Henry's tone as unnecessarily harsh. Leo did not argue. He returned his access badge to Henry, collected his personal items from his locker, and left the building an hour before his shift ended. On his way out, he stopped by the small meeting room where Audrey was waiting for her mother. He knelt down so they were at eye level. "Keep learning," he said softly. "Not because you have to, because you want to." Audrey nodded, but her eyes were red. She watched him walk away, and something inside her went quiet. The consequences unfolded over the next 10 days. Audrey stopped asking questions. She completed her homework mechanically, without curiosity or joy. Her teacher, Vivian Porter, called Callista to express concern. The spark that had made Audrey stand out, the eagerness that had driven her to explore ideas beyond the curriculum, had disappeared. At the same time, Sterling Dynamics' algorithm continued to drift. The engineering team ran simulations, adjusted parameters, and consulted external experts. But the instability persisted. The government presentation was 2 weeks away, and confidence was eroding. Investors began to ask pointed questions. If the platform could not perform under controlled conditions, how could it be trusted with real-world applications? William assured them the issues were minor, that the team was close to a solution. But privately, he was running out of options. Callista sat in her office late one night, staring at the city lights below. She thought about the memo she had signed, the decision she had made to prioritize safety and reputation over everything else. It had seemed logical at the time, but now, watching her daughter withdraw and her company falter, she wondered if logic had been enough. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Serena had continued digging into the archived files. Unable to shake the feeling that something had been overlooked, she found a set of system logs from the day of the emergency shutdown 5 years ago. They had been marked as reviewed and filed, but no one had actually examined them in detail. When she opened the files and cross-referenced them with the incident report, the discrepancy was glaring. The emergency shutdown had not been unnecessary. In fact, it had prevented a cascade failure that would have destroyed the entire data center. The logs showed temperature spikes in 3 server racks, a pattern that indicated imminent hardware failure. Leo had recognized the signs and initiated the shutdown protocol, overriding direct orders from William, who had insisted they push through to meet the product launch deadline. If Leo had obeyed, the resulting fire would have caused catastrophic damage, not just to equipment, but potentially to personnel. The report had omitted this context entirely. Instead, it framed the shutdown as an act of insubordination, a failure to follow leadership directives. Serena found an email buried in the archives, sent from William to the board the day after the incident. In it, he argued that acknowledging the near miss would damage investor confidence and suggested framing Leo's actions as a judgment error rather than a life-saving decision. Serena printed the logs in the email, placed them in a folder, and walked into Callista's office without knocking. "You need to see this," she said. Callista read the documents in silence. When she finished, she set them down and stared at the wall for a long time. She thought about Leo's quiet resignation, the way he had accepted blame without defending himself. She thought about the non-disclosure agreement he had signed, the one that had kept him silent for 5 years. And she thought about Audrey, who had seen something in him that the rest of them had missed. "The presentation is in 8 days, Serena said. "If we go forward with the current system, we're going to fail." Publicly, Callista nodded slowly. "Find him." It took 3 days to locate Leo. He was not listed in any current employee databases, and his forwarding address from 5 years ago had long since expired. Serena eventually tracked him down through a contact in the facilities department, who remembered that Leo had mentioned living near the industrial district on the east side of the city. Callista drove there herself, ignoring Serena's offer to send someone else. The neighborhood was a patchwork of low-rise apartments and small workshops, the kind of place where people worked hard and kept to themselves. Callista found Leo's building wedged between a laundromat and a corner store. She climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door marked 308. Leo answered, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. He wore jeans and a faded t-shirt, a far cry from the gray uniform she had grown accustomed to seeing. Behind him, she could see a small apartment, cluttered but clean. On the kitchen table sat a heart rate monitor and a stack of medical pamphlets. "Miss Sterling," he said evenly. "I wasn't expecting you. I need to talk to you," Callista said. "May I come in?" Leo hesitated, then stepped aside. As she entered, Callista noticed a boy, perhaps 10 years old, sitting on the couch with a book. He looked up, his gaze curious but cautious. Leo introduced him as Ethan, his son. The boy had a medical alert bracelet on his wrist, and Callista remembered the heart monitor on the table. "Ethan has a mild heart condition," Leo explained. "Nothing life-threatening, but it requires monitoring. That's part of why I took the janitorial position. The hours were flexible, and the insurance covered his treatments." Callista felt something inside her crack. She had judged this man, signed a memo that ended his employment, without ever asking why he had taken the job in the first place. She sat down across from him, struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for what happened 5 years ago, and for what happened last week. I should have asked questions before I acted." Leo studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Why are you here now?" "Because I was wrong," Callista said, "and because I need your help. The algorithm is failing, and I think you're the only one who can fix it." She explained the situation, the presentation, the stakes. She told him about the logs Serena had found, the evidence that he had been right all along. She offered him a temporary consulting contract, anonymous if he preferred, with terms that would allow him to work remotely and maintain his privacy. But Leo shook his head. "I'll help," he said, "but only if you agree to 3 conditions. First, no more scapegoating. If someone on your team makes a mistake, you address it honestly. Second, you make the system logs transparent. No more burying evidence to protect reputations. And third, you let Audrey keep learning. Not because it's productive or impressive, because she enjoys it." Callista agreed without hesitation. They set up a small, off-the-books war room in a vacant office on the 14th floor. Serena handled the logistics, ensuring that only a handful of people knew what was happening. Vivian Porter, Audrey's teacher, joined the group to provide guidance on how to present complex ideas in ways that were accessible and fair. The goal was not just to fix the algorithm, but to build a system that could be explained and defended in front of an audience that included government auditors and policymakers. Leo started by revisiting the napkin sketch he had shared with Audrey weeks ago. It had been a simple exercise, a way to explain how patterns could be broken down into smaller, more manageable pieces. But the principle behind it was powerful. Instead of trying to correct errors after they appeared, the system could be designed to detect extreme anomalies in real time and adjust before they compounded. He translated the concept into a technical framework, outlining a mechanism for self-correction that relied on identifying outliers early in the data stream. Callista tested it in a sandbox environment, running simulations with historical data. The error rates dropped significantly. The system was not perfect, but it was stable, reliable, and most importantly, explainable. Vivian worked with Audrey, helping her prepare a simple explanation of the core idea. The goal was not to have an 8-year-old present to the government officials, but to ensure that the logic was clear enough that even a child could understand it. If Audrey could explain it, anyone could. They worked late into the night, the office lit by desk lamps and laptop screens. Callista found herself learning as much from Leo as she was from the code itself. He had a way of breaking down complexity that felt intuitive, almost meditative. He spoke about algorithms the way a musician might talk about rhythm, finding the patterns that created harmony instead of noise. On the fourth night, Audrey and Ethan sat together in the corner of the room, working on a school project. Callista watched them, heads bent over a shared notebook, and realized that this was what Leo had been trying to teach all along. Learning was not a transaction. It was a conversation. On the morning of the presentation, William Harding discovered what had been happening. Someone from the engineering team had noticed unusual activity in the sandbox environment and reported it to him. When he learned that Leo was involved, his reaction was immediate and forceful. He sent an email to the executive board, copied to the investors, accusing Callista of violating security protocols by bringing back a former employee who had been terminated for cause. Henry Marks escalated the situation by revoking Leo's temporary access credentials, citing liability concerns. By 9 o'clock, the building's security system had been updated to flag Leo's biometric data, ensuring he could not enter the premises. The presentation was scheduled for 2 that afternoon, and without Leo, the revised algorithm was incomplete. Callista received a call from the lead investor 30 minutes later. He was direct and unambiguous. "If you go forward with this presentation, you do it with the team we've approved. No consultants, no last-minute changes. We need stability, not experimentation." Callista sat at her desk, staring at the phone after the call ended. She thought about the memo she had signed 2 weeks ago, the one that had prioritized reputation over truth. She thought about Audrey's tears, Leo's quiet resignation, and the years she had spent building a company on the principle that precision mattered more than people. Then she thought about the napkin, still tucked into Audrey's backpack. The one with the first logic puzzle Leo had drawn, the one that had started everything. She pulled it out and smoothed it flat on her desk. The ink was smudged, the paper worn, but the pattern was still visible. Count the steps, find the rhythm, correct the errors. Audrey appeared in the doorway, holding her school backpack. She walked over and placed a hand on her mother's arm. "Mom," she said softly, "count your breaths." Callista closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and made her decision. The presentation took place in a high-ceilinged auditorium on the government's West Campus. 200 people filled the seats, including auditors, policy advisors, and representatives from competing firms. Callista stood at the podium, flanked by her engineering team. William was notably absent, citing a scheduling conflict. The stage was set with 3 large screens, each displaying real-time data feeds from the algorithm. The demonstration began smoothly. The system processed incoming data, flagged potential risks, and generated forecasts with impressive accuracy. But 10 minutes in, something shifted. A spike appeared in one of the data streams, an anomaly that should have been filtered out. The algorithm hesitated, recalibrating, but the error persisted. Murmurs rippled through the audience. On the screens, the confidence intervals began to widen, the predictions growing less certain. Callista felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on her. She glanced at Serena, who was standing in the wings with a laptop. Serena's expression was tense, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to diagnose the issue. But Callista already knew what had happened. William had seeded the data stream with deliberate noise, a sabotage designed to make the revised algorithm fail in the most public way possible. She took a breath, then turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an intentional stress test. What you're seeing is not a flaw in the system, but an opportunity to demonstrate how it responds to deliberate interference. The room went silent. Callista stepped away from the podium and gestured to the side entrance. "I'd like to invite someone to explain what's happening and how we're going to fix it." Leo Carter walked onto the stage. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, no longer the invisible figure in a gray uniform. He carried a tablet and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The audience shifted, confused, but Callista did not waver. "This is Leo Carter," she said. "He designed the original safety protocols for our data systems, and he's the reason this company is still standing. He's going to show you how we solve problems in real time." Leo connected his tablet to the main display. He pulled up a diagnostic interface, isolating the corrupted data stream and tracing it back to its source. Then, in language that was clear and methodical, he explained the three-step process. Identify the anomaly, separate it from the clean data, and recalibrate the baseline. He executed the corrections live, adjusting parameters and watching as the error rates dropped. Within 5 minutes, the system had stabilized. The confidence intervals tightened, the forecasts returned to their expected ranges, and the screens glowed with steady, reliable numbers. The audience remained silent, processing what they had just witnessed. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Others joined, the applause building until it filled the auditorium. The lead government auditor stood, nodding slowly, and approached the stage to shake Leo's hand. Serena, still in the wings, activated a secondary screen. On it appeared the recovered system logs from 5 years ago, the ones that proved Leo had prevented a catastrophic failure by acting against orders. She displayed the email trail, showing William's directive to ignore the warning signs and his subsequent effort to frame the shutdown as insubordination. The evidence was damning, undeniable, and projected for everyone to see. William Harding, watching from a remote feed, knew his career was over. By the end of the day, he had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. Henry Marks, who had enabled much of the misconduct, was demoted to a non-supervisory role. The board issued a public statement, acknowledging past errors in judgment and committing to greater transparency moving forward. The contract with the government was signed that evening. In the days that followed, Callista offered Leo a position as head of reliability engineering. It was a senior role, well compensated, with the authority to overhaul the company's safety and transparency protocols. But Leo declined. He had a different idea. "I want to create something smaller," he said. "A learning lab. Not for executives or high performers. For the kids of the people who keep this building running, the ones whose parents clean the floors, fix the wiring, stock the kitchens. They deserve a place to ask questions too." Callista agreed immediately. They named it the Audrey Lab, a small classroom on the ground floor equipped with whiteboards, computers, and a library of books on mathematics, science, and logic. Leo would teach there 3 afternoons a week, working with children who had been overlooked by traditional systems. Ethan would be one of the first students, along with Audrey. 2 months later, Audrey and Ethan entered a citywide competition called Math in Motion, a challenge that required students to design a physical model demonstrating a mathematical concept. They built a kinetic sculpture based on the napkin sketch, a series of interconnected levers and counterweights that illustrated how errors could cascade or self-correct, depending on the system's design. They won first place in their age category. Callista attended the awards ceremony, sitting in the audience beside Leo. When Audrey's name was called, she walked to the stage with confidence, holding the worn napkin in one hand and the trophy in the other. She looked out at the crowd and began to speak. "I learned that the best teachers don't always sit at the front of the classroom," she said. "Sometimes they wear uniforms nobody notices. And the hardest problems aren't about finding the right answer. They're about learning to trust the people who help you ask the right questions." The applause was long and heartfelt. Callista felt tears sting her eyes, something she had not allowed herself to do in years. She glanced at Leo, who was smiling quietly, his hands folded in his lap. Ethan sat beside him, beaming with pride. After the ceremony, the 3 of them walked out into the late afternoon Sunday. The city was loud and busy, indifferent to their small victories, but it did not matter. They had found something rare and valuable, a space where curiosity could flourish without fear, where mistakes were not punishments but opportunities to learn. Callista had changed too. She left the office earlier now, making time for dinners with Audrey, for conversations that were not hurried or transactional. She asked questions instead of issuing directives, listened instead of solving. The company continued to grow, but its culture began to shift. Employees noticed that transparency was no longer a buzzword, but a practice, that admitting uncertainty was no longer seen as weakness. Leo remained in the background, content to work in his lab, and teach children who reminded him why he had fallen in love with engineering in the first place. He and Callista developed a friendship that was quiet and unhurried, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that the best solutions often came from the most unexpected places. On a warm evening in early spring, the Audrey lab hosted an open house. Parents and children filled the small room, examining projects and asking questions. Callista stood near the door, watching Audrey explain a geometric proof to a younger student. Leo was nearby, guiding Ethan through a coding exercise. The room buzzed with energy, with the kind of laughter and curiosity that could not be manufactured or mandated. Serena appeared at Callista's side, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said, "this is going to cost the company money." "The lab doesn't generate revenue," Callista smiled. "Some things are worth more than profit." As the sun set, casting golden light through the windows, Callista realized that this was the moment she had been searching for all along. Not the board meetings or the investor calls or the accolades, but this, a room full of people learning together, asking questions and finding joy in the process. It was messy and imperfect and beautifully human, and it was enough.